That's a beautiful sweater.
That's good.
So we're taking up in the budget adjustment language that we would be adding to deal with the teachers' COLA. And just to go down memory lane, last year, if you can remember, after we had done a lot of changes in our teachers' retirement benefit statute, one thing that was retained, it really wasn't even a topic of discussion, was an amendment made in 2016, I believe, by Treasurer Pierce. At that point, there was a danger of, because of deflation, benefits actually being reduced. So there was a change that prevented a reduction, but also put in a cap of cost of living inflation at 5%. And teachers get 50% of that inflation. Well, last year, inflation was much greater than that. So teachers were very surprised when they only got 50% of the, half of the 5%. And we had meetings with them, and we negotiated a willingness to remove that 5% threshold or cap. But we were concerned that inflation might continue another year. Fortunately for everyone, inflation subsided. But in order to fulfill our commitment to remove that 5% cap, that comes with a cost to the pension fund, because there is a risk that in the future we could experience inflation that exceeded that 5%, and the actuaries were using that 5% as part of in their calculation. So at that point, I said, if we wanted to make changes in the pensions after spending so much time dealing with underfunding, if we're going to make a change, we had to fund it. So in last year's budget in the education fund, we reserved $9.1 million. That was the estimated cost at the time to fund this policy change that would remove the 5% cap. But we held that in reserve and held any action in abeyance until we had a second year to see if we were going to have inflation at a higher rate, and that might influence the amount of that 9.1. And so that's where we are. We're holding 9.1 in reserve. We have a commitment to alter the statute. And now we have folks from the treasurer's office. Unfortunately, the treasurer didn't sound great on the phone yesterday, and he sent me a text that says he's feeling worse today. But we have his staff here that are going to explain what is being required here, and the amount that is going to be required to affect this policy. Last year, we dealt with that higher rate of inflation with a one-time payment to teachers, but it didn't build the base. It was a one-time. So that's just kind of a trip down memory lane. And now we're going to take action on sort of what we had set forward last year in our negotiations. So I don't know who's going to lead this first. Tim, are you the lead buffalo, so to speak, on the presentation today?
Yes, I am. Tim Duggan, Director of the Vermont Retirement Systems.
Okay, thank you. You want to introduce, you got familiar faces, but introduce the staff with you as well.
Sure. We have our Policy Director, Ashlyn Doyon, and we have our Chief Financial Officer, Jeremiah Breer.
Thank you. So I'll take it, let you take it from here.
Great, thank you. And we submitted the study that was required in the budget, and those should be posted on the website for today's committee hearing. So thank you for that summary, Madam Chair. I think that's a good table setting of where we are, and I think I'll just cut to the chase on numbers. As part of that one-time payment that you referred to earlier, we carried that out in October of this year. We made that one-time payment. The legislature gave us $3 million for the task. That one-time payment came in at about $2.7 million. As you can imagine, over the course of this effort, we expenses of actuarial work, programming costs, and some modest postage to alert members about this payment. And so all in, we have $160,000 left of that $3 million appropriation. So that's sitting in the pension fund. And I wanted to just alert folks of that because that $160,000 was more than we needed for the one-time payment, and that can be applied to any future change. The task that was asked of us was to, after our experience studies of this year, to reassess that $9.1 million cost, given some additional some growth in the membership and some additional payroll development. That $9.1 million was increased to $9.5 million. So that's the total cost of the go forward change, $9.5 million. As I said, we still have the $160,000 left over from the one-time payments. So that's a total of $9.34 million that would be needed in additional funds to fund the go forward change.
Yes, go ahead.
So just so I make sure I understand that part, that's like the actuaries looking at what they think the COLA will be in the future for the employees that we have or the teachers that we have, and making that estimate, that calculating it,
The rest.
the new analysis of the 50%. They said it's going to be more money than the way they were calculating it before. Did I say that right?
Sort of. So what they're doing, what they did both.
I think you said.
Okay, let's hear
What they did both times is they calculated a present value of benefits. So if we make this change in today's dollars, the cost of this benefit was last year it was 9.1. This year it's 9.5. The reason for the difference is, as you know, every year we do a valuation, and so we have a more recent snapshot of the membership, the payroll, the expected benefits. And this year in particular, we also did an experience study where we take a look at our assumptions for what we think of future retirement rates, inflation, all the things. And so what the actuaries were doing was running the same present value of benefits calculation, but off more updated data. And because that data came in with some additional members, some additional payroll growth, that $9.1 million, which was estimated last year, is $9.5 million this year.
And the reason it was more than prior is because of this difference of the interpretation of the two different acts, the way the actuaries were doing it, they were doing it prior to basically the lower way. And then when we clarified what it meant, they said, oh, that's going to be it. You're going to need more money because of risk of a higher inflation in future years.
Well, right, because this is an order of operations issue right now. So the pre-2016 way, you took half of inflation, and as long as it was under 5%, teachers would get that 5%. The post-2016 way is you first cap inflation at 5% and then take half. So the highest COLA someone would get is 2.5%. So you can see that where the possibility exists to have something between 2.5 and 5% going in the future, that's going to cost a little bit more. Yeah. Now, we don't know what inflation is. So what they're basically doing is setting an assumed amount of inflation, but with this different mechanism bolted on top of it. And that's what creates the additional cost.
So we're fortunate in some regards because we have reserved. We haven't got a second year where, in fact, inflation exceeded the 5%. And so what we're doing is having to fund the change in the policy and the actual estimate of what that potential cost exposure of the fund would be with the statutory change, which we had committed to. So we had 9.1 and then we have 160 and the total cost is 9.5. So we're just not too far off really with the total amount. And you've testified before the House.
Yes.
And then there's this third bullet point, right? About the 32 million. What is
That
that?
was in,
Oh,
what
yes.
that was informational. The previous analysis that we completed last February, that looked at a couple of different mechanisms to address this issue. The one that we're talking about here contemplates the one-time payment last year, not building that into the base and making this change go forward. Were we to have built that into the base, that's the $30 million number there, or roughly 30 million.
That was part of why we did a one-time because of the ongoing costs of these
And do then, if this is
teachers.
if schools add more personnel, does that have any effect on these numbers?
Well, the new ADEC, as it moves forward, would reflect this policy, this statutory change. So it would, for anyone hired new, they would just as you would with any revision to the ADEC, whether it might be demographics or, I guess VPIC really hasn't changed much of anything in terms of the assumptions on investment returns and so forth. So yes, this will impact. It could impact the ADEC, I guess, Tim, future.
Modestly, to be honest, this is not going to be a substantial item. So I think to the question, if we were to have maybe more teachers come on board, in the next few years, then down the road, more retired teachers would be eligible for a COLA. So is there a small effect potentially? But I want to say, at that point, it's not substantial. I think once we pre-fund it, it's baked into the whole assumptions of the system, and then we're subject to the year-over-year variability that we're going to face in any event.
But we have to make this one-time payment into the fund in order to not do what we've done before, and that is add costs and not fund the policy change. So that's what we're doing here. This memo is obviously there's a lot of information here, but basically, in a nutshell, we've talked about what it does and why we're doing it, and the commitment that we made last year when inflation was, 7%?
7.6.
7 point, so it's very. Do you have other information you want to share? Obviously, we're going to have to change the language that exists relative to the maximum. And
That's correct. And
yeah.
and we provided some suggested language. That's one of the submissions that should be up on your website right now. The only other point that I'd raise is that, as you know, the change in the 2016 law came about, or we realized it last year because inflation was high. It was the first time that cap was triggered. And because that was somewhat of a surprise, I asked my team to go back and because we made a lot of changes in Act 114 to really take a close scrub of that language and just confirm that there are no potential surprises out there in the event inflation is high, low, this, that, or the other thing. Did that. And there were a couple areas that we found less than clear in Act 114 because the section underwent major changes. They address both how the floor is handled and how early retirees are addressed. Neither were being changed in Act 114, but the language is somewhat ambiguous. So we described that in the last section of the report, and we proposed in our statutory languages some language to make sure that those things that were not intended to change in Act 114 it's clear that they're not changing. So we just don't want to find ourselves in this situation again. And I give a lot of credit to my team for digging into the statute in such depth and unearthing.
That's this document here that we have that, with the annotations of the comments that,
We also have,
annotation of the changes being proposed.
Yes.
we also have it written more like in a bill from Jen Carter.
So other questions, are there if more information that we haven't covered yet that would be helpful here?
I'm happy to answer any questions that you have on this, but I think those are the high points that I wanted to emphasize today. Happy to work with your council or fiscal folks on any questions that they have.
Questions? Pretty straightforward. Well, I think. Basically, we're going back to the pre-2016 rules, and we're funding it, and we have reserves that just about covered it, and so we just have a small gap. And so we're fulfilling, the commitment that we made last year. And if there are no further questions, now you have other.
That's what I was gonna say, there's other language changes.
I know, I'm gonna move to that. That's
Okay.
on the able account language. Is that what you're referencing?
Well, that, and I think there's others that are not related to
Yeah.
teacher exemption.
Yeah. But relative to what we're doing here, any
Yeah.
further questions? Okay, all right, so we'll keep going then. We have a couple of other things. You have BAA language from regarding the contribute able accounts.
Yes, we have, for the record, Ashlyn Doyon, Director of Policy in the Treasurer's Office. We have 5 other, what I think are very simple language requests for the Budget Adjustment Act. You'll see these outlined in your memo. It's dated January 3rd. The first one is the able Medicaid recapture language. So under current statute, I think that most folks are probably familiar with the Vermont Able account program at this point. These are the tax advantage investment accounts that the Treasurer's Office runs for individuals with disabilities. Under the current statute, when there is a death of an Able account participant, Medicaid has the right to go in and recapture those funds. This change seeks to remove that provision. So, and the reason behind this proposed change is, this program launched in February of 2017. It took several years before we experienced the death of a participant. We've had, 20 to 30 deaths so far, and the average account balances that are left at the time of the death of an account participant are quite low. The process of the Medicaid recapture has, 1, proven to be administratively burdensome, and 2, we found that it is a deterrent to get participants and their families enrolled and participating in these accounts. So I'm happy to answer any questions about that. But what would happen now with this change is, after the death of a participant, if there was a probate process and no beneficiary was found, these funds would be escheated to unclaimed property in a manner similar to any other bank account or investment account that someone might have that is not under this 529A disability account code.
I didn't realize Medicaid was doing estate recoveries. Huh. The state of Vermont is doing recoveries for Medicaid from estates. Huh.
So we've had, I think, about 20 accounts that Vermont Medicaid has recovered so far for the ABLE program. And we'd like to change that practice.
All right, so this has been discussed, obviously, how's your revenues that are being assumed in the Medicaid program? So the question is this supported by the Department of Vermont Health Access?
Yes, I've met with Monica Ogilvy, the state Medicaid director. She supports this change, as does, of course, the Vermont Developmental Disabilities Council, who we worked with extensively to stand up ABLE accounts back in 2017.
I would imagine, the rep would be fairly modest for any recovery, but just thought we should ask.
Costs more to recover than what
It might.
we would get.
All right.
So
So
if it's okay with you, I can move on to change number 2.
Yes, if you would, please.
Sure. So last year, you probably all remember we passed the Vermont Saves legislation. And that is the public retirement program that we hope to launch very soon. In working toward the launch of this program, we've come across a couple of technical changes that we think are prudent to make at this time. The first change is simply changing the word salary to wages. We found that this is more in line with the language that other states are using. The second change is changing from the word that we use to describe an employer's actions for the enforcement mechanism from simply enrolling to complying with the legislation. This similarly is a change that was recommended to us by other states who've enacted legislation as one that's more specific and clear. The third change is really the only substantive change. This change is in the effective date. It essentially allows us to begin the program sooner if we are able to. The legislation last year had the program coming in phases. After the passage of the legislation, we heard feedback both from other states, but perhaps more importantly for our purposes, from organizations like the Chambers of Commerce that said that, for Vermont and the numbers of employees that businesses have here, it makes sense to have everything just launch at the same time rather than in phases, which may be confusing to communicate to employers. We are also, I'll mention, actively pursuing a multi-state partnership that we think will allow us to get the program off the ground and running even sooner. And so this date change just gives us flexibility to begin.
Gives you the authority to do a multi-state partnership?
Yes, we have that authority in the enabling statute. So this just gives us the flexibility to start sooner if we are able to. It does not remove the deadline by which we must start, however.
What is that deadline?
I believe it's 2025.
So you want to change salaries to wages, use the word complying versus enrolling. Effective date is 2025, but allow you to do it sooner if you're able. Do it all at once, not a phase-in, simply because of the small scope of Vermont. And then the authority to enter into a multi-state partnership.
Yes, you have that correct, except that we already have the authority to do a multi-state partnership. I was
Okay.
sharing that information for your awareness, but we're not seeking that change. We already have it.
Oh, I thought you were seeking the authority, sorry.
It looks like the final is July 1st, 2026.
Yeah.
All covered employees will begin participation by that date.
July 1st, 2026?
That's
Yeah.
what I'm thinking.
Okay, and so you're optimistic that,
I'm just not reading fast enough.
but you're optimistic that there is a good chance that in fact you can do it sooner.
And you'll do it all at once, is what you're saying?
Yes.
Or you've already made that decision to do it all at once, but this will give you the statutory ability to do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we think in our conversations with the most reputable vendors that we hope to use, we think that's going to be the best way to do things.
And you weren't required to do a phase-in, or were you? Or are you just telling us that you're able to do it all at once?
We're able to do it all at once.
It looked like it.
I don't think it would require
I don't
phase-in.
know if it requires, but there was a phase in and that's being struck out.
Yes,
Alright.
so the way that it was structured previously, we could have started the program and anyone at any time could have joined, but there were phases in terms of the compliance for employers. So employers had to actively enroll by certain timeframes if, depending on the number of employees that they had. But they also could have enrolled earlier if they chose to.
And I'm assuming we'll probably see this in the House past EAA. Doesn't seem too controversial.
Yes, I think so. We've testified in both House Appropriations and House Commerce, and it's been met with general support so far.
All right.
Okay, so we're getting simpler as we move along, I hope. Language request number 3 is unclaimed property, and it's specific to how we might deal with virtual currency. In 2019, we updated the state's Uniform Unclaimed Property Act. At the time, we did not include this virtual currency provision. However, we'd like to include it now. This change basically states that if a holder has virtual currency that they need to escheat to the state, prior to escheating it to the state, they have to liquidate it into, regular currency, US dollars for us. This will prevent us from holding things like Bitcoin or a locked cryptocurrency wallet or something like that, that would be not only difficult for us to hold, but difficult for us to pay out. So, any questions?
So I have the holder shall liquidate. So who would be the holder? Obviously, abandoned property, you don't know the owner. So the holder is being responsible to liquidate. Can you give us an example of a definition of who would be a holder? Bank?
The holder is typically the bank or a financial institution. We also see a lot of, utilities that are holders, if there's utility deposit, or insurance companies, those kinds of things. So the holder is really the company, not the individual that owns the money.
How do they liquidate? Are they gonna have the password? I mean, it raises some interesting questions.
So there are some,
That's why
they may have capability within their own company to do this. I do know that there are other states that are, we took this language modeled off of the state of Michigan. I also know that the state of Colorado is actually accepting cryptocurrency as for payments for taxes. However, they don't actually accept the cryptocurrency. They contract with a third-party service to liquidate it. So there are folks out there that are doing this. We are just not doing it as a state. So we're essentially saying you have to find someone to do this or do it yourself before you send it to us. Unfortunately, I don't know the technical nuances of how one might change virtual currency to US dollars. I know that there are people out there that do.
Okay, Andy?
And Ashton, are there any other properties where you have this requirement? Because I can imagine there could be some obscure securities or something that would also be difficult to liquidate, that you require them to liquidate it before they hand over.
I can't, Tim, please jump in because you were our general counsel when we did the revised Uniform Unclaimed Property Act, but I don't believe that we have a similar provision for other types of properties.
I don't know if it's a requirement, but we do typically liquidate stocks after a certain period of time. It ends up being a good idea, particularly in the crypto space, where, as you've seen, extremely volatile markets where your Bitcoin could be X and then 10X, then, a couple weeks later, and vice versa. Liquidating it kind of gives it a bit more of a stable, you had the equivalent of $1,000 when that had to be escheated. That means that you're going to have that $1,000 when you come to claim it from the state, rather than something that's wildly more or less than it. So we do that with stocks pretty regularly. We liquidate them after we hold them for a period of time. The details of it are dusty now.
Do you have that same protective language that somebody that claims it and the stock happened to go up in that time wants to get that value, that the language you're adding for crypto, do you have that already for the stocks that you said?
We do have the protective language for the stocks that the state is held harmless for changes in value after it's liquidated, yes.
Okay.
So, I'm gonna move on to number 4.
Sure. So number 4 has to do with the Municipal Equipment Loan Fund. This is a loan fund that we run out of the Treasurer's Office that assists municipalities in purchasing things like construction equipment, fire or emergency equipment, other types of heavy vehicles with low interest loans. There has been a cap on the loan amount, the total loan amount of $110,000 per application for, I think, as long as this program has been in existence. I'm not sure that it's ever been updated. And so this year we are just seeking to make an inflationary adjustment to have the cap go up to $150,000. We're not seeking any additional appropriation. This fund seems to be doing well, and there is plenty of money in it for the purpose.
Questions on that? Number 5, emergency personnel, survivors benefit.
This one is very similar to the Municipal Equipment Loan Fund. The state treasurer administers the Emergency Personnel Survivors Benefit Fund, which provides a monetary benefit to the survivors of emergency personnel if they die in the line of duty or from an occupation-related illness. Under the current statute, the maximum of that monetary benefit is $50,000. Similarly, I'm not sure that this has ever been updated. We seek to update the maximum allowable monetary benefit to $80,000.
Questions on that? How much is in the fund?
In the Emergency Personnel Survivors Benefit Fund, there's approximately $160,000. We've not made a payment out of this fund since 2016. Of course, we hope to never have to make a payment out of this fund. And the $80,000 functions as a maximum. So there is, there's a 4-member board that approves these payments. Depending on the balance of the fund at any given time, when there is an application for a benefit, that board has the discretion to adjust that monetary benefit to be congruent with the amount of funds available.
Thank you. So just updating. And then we've already done number 6.
Yes.
The cost of living, which was the more substantive one. Other questions of the Treasury? I hope none of you get sick. The Treasurer didn't sound very great yesterday, so stay well. And if we don't have any more questions, then we'll let you get back to your other work. Thank you, though, for coming before the committee this afternoon, and we'll look forward to what changes. We're going to assume that the House is incorporating all the changes, but we'll, if anything should be a problem or whatever, I'm sure you'll get in touch with us. So the only other area that I had talked to the treasurer about yesterday, and I'll share it with the committee. And I don't know whether, Tim, you were gonna speak to it, but the budget adjustment we've had some discussion, proposes to change our debt service from an appropriation to a transfer. And by doing so, it reduces the amount of the 5% statutory reserve, or about 3.9, is it, million? I will share the treasurer's memo, but at this point, my concern is we need to have some fiscal rigor, and that the more you start using this mechanism to somehow lower the 5%, it's the precedent. At this case, in this time, and this is what the treasurer's office was saying, is that right now this amount is so minimal that it's not really an immediate hazard, to use his term. But certainly the precedent, or need to be vigilant about this, is certainly going to have to be, on our minds into the future. So Tim, I don't know if you wanted to, were you or Jeremiah speak to this?
Yeah, I can. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was
can.
deferring to you, Jeremiah.
I can speak to this, Senator Kitchell, and I think I think the memo pretty well outlines it. So, I mean, you have this requested change of, the status quo was that the debt service had been an appropriation, and then there was a transfer to the debt service fund. And what this change does is it eliminates that appropriation and has you just dealing with the transfer piece. And as you already know, as you already mentioned, that the statutory reserves are based on 5% of appropriations, and so eliminating that saves about a $3.5 million set aside for the reserves. And in speaking with finance and management, they have been pretty transparent that $3.5 million savings to the reserves is part of the motivation behind requesting this change, given the tight budget situation that we are headed into. It also just sort of operationally saves them a step, because in the situation where there's an appropriation and a transfer, they've got to do accounting for both of those pieces. And so if you cut out the appropriation piece and just make it a transfer, it's a simpler way to handle it. I do think that piece is probably a lesser consideration, but it was also part of what they were thinking. And so in speaking with finance and management, their stance is that this, should not be an issue with the rating agencies for two reasons. One is that the reserves fluctuate in tandem with appropriations, and so they do go up and down from year to year. And this $3.5 million is not a material amount. And their second sort of justification is that, while it will reduce the statutory reserves, the state will still be funding those statutory reserves in full. So it reduces the requirement, but we're still meeting the requirement. And so from the treasurer's office perspective, I think on point one, we wholeheartedly agree with that. On point two, I think there is perhaps a little bit of nuance there, in that, it is true that the rating agencies care for meeting that statutory amount. They also do care about the total amount, regardless of, that statutory requirement. And so I think I think the concern, about the precedent this may set, is valid. But as you noted, the most immediate, this $3.5 million is not something that's going to cause any alarm with the rating agencies. And from Treasury's perspective, as long as we have the funds in the debt service to pay, the debt service as it comes due, we are good. And so, from the rating agency's perspective, it's never a great, from their perspective, if you go down the road of reducing reserves, but it's not really a big deal, sort of with this amount of money. So I think that just adds a little bit of color from our end.
All right. Any questions on that? Thank you for that. And we do have a memo from the treasurer, which I can share, that puts kind of in writing what we just heard. Yeah. You can have it. We'll make copies for your reference, but it's basically exactly aligned with the testimony that we just got from Jeremiah. Anything else? Does that, I think, take care of everything that you wanted and we wanted to talk about?
I think so. I think that covers everything on our end. Thank you very much to the committee for your time this afternoon.
Thank you. Stay well. So now it's 1:45 and I have to go next door. I guess at this point, we are done taking testimony for the week. And we'll keep working on the budget adjustment, as I said, the House plans to hopefully get it out next Friday. So we'll be moving along. And we've still got to do reports. I see you've got.
Okay, so I saw Senator Booth came in just in time for the report.
Yeah, he wants to do that.
Disappointed on that.
But we'll finish it up next week.
Life is full of disappointment.
Yeah.
I'm lucky under.